Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thanks all for coming tonight. I'm Jay Christopher Garcia. I'm the user experience lead here at Indeed. When I was an undergraduate, I'd occasionally get asked to make posters for the university's theater department. And it was a lot of fun. You know, as an undergraduate, I got some good experience. I made a little bit of money. It wasn't much, but you know, at least I wasn't doing my work for free, because as a designer, you're not supposed to work for free. And you know, at the end of the project, you know, I got a big stack of posters and I could take it home, and you know, I'd set it on my floor and I'd look at it. And so it was really rewarding in that aspect. But one of the aspects that I found was actually kind of difficult and frustrating was not learning how to produce the posters. It was figuring out whether or not my designs were any good. And by any good, I mean sell theater seats, because that was the whole point of making this poster, was to fill seats. So I didn't know if these posters were doing that. As a result of not being able to analyze my work, I felt it was really difficult for me to know how to make better posters, and I felt like I was missing out on this opportunity to learn. So although I was getting lots of opportunities to make more posters, I wasn't able to kind of recycle that knowledge into the next poster. I didn't know what I was doing that was good, that I should continue to do, and I didn't know the bad things that I was doing that I should just stop doing. And really, I was probably just getting better at making posters that the guy who hired me liked. So I feel really fortunate to be working in a medium where it's not only easy, but that it's even possible for me to evaluate the effectiveness of my work. Because I think good design produces results. My opinion and others' opinions of my work isn't really very meaningful. Just because everyone in the room thinks the design is good, it doesn't mean that it is. Consensus isn't an accurate measure of the effectiveness of a design. I want to be able to demonstrate to myself, to the people that I work with, to really anyone, the value of my work and the value of design. Because I think good design produces results. And this is what I've been working on for about the last 7 years. And this is Indeed. We help millions of people all over the world find jobs. And this is what our search results page looks like today. And this is what it looked like 5 years ago. Now, I always want to improve the site, but with each change that I make, I want to be able to demonstrate that it was actually better. Not that I thought it was better, not that I felt that it was better, but that it was actually better. So this page and nearly all of the consumer-facing products at Indeed have evolved over time based on the data that we collect and through A/B testing. A/B testing allows us to determine the impact of changes to our website. And here's an example A/B test. So on the left, you have the A group, and that's typically the control group. The control group is going to get the standard behavior that everybody gets on your site today. And then we have the B group. And the B group is going to be exactly the same as the A group, except for this change that we're going to introduce. And in this case, we're going to change the button color from gray to blue. Now we're going to record a whole bunch of data about the users in these two test groups. And then we're going to compare that data to try to determine which one of these implementations is the best. Now the name A/B testing implies that there's only two groups, but there's really no limit on the number of groups you can have. You can have as many as you want. And you can also run several A/B tests at the same time. This is called multivariate testing. So in this particular example, not only are we changing the color of the button, but we're also changing the button's label. So we're running lots of different tests at the same time here at Indeed. There's currently 114 tests running, and there's 244 variations of those tests. So each user on Indeed is experiencing one out of about 84,000 possible unique experiences on Indeed. And I want to emphasize that this isn't just testing on our search results page. All of these tests aren't just about search results. This is across virtually every product that we offer here. So obviously it's in the job seeker experience. It is our search results page, but it's also posting your resume or editing your resume. We're testing employer products. So, you know, posting jobs, searching resumes, contacting potential employees. We're testing emails. We test our mobile website. We test practically everything that you consider Indeed. And we found A/B testing to actually be the most effective way for us to quickly improve our website. There's other ways besides A/B testing that you can do evaluations. We can evaluate our website different ways. So one way is like using a lab setup, right? So you're in a lab and you're in a room and there's a two-way mirror and you have the subject in there and they're doing something and you observe them. Maybe you're even recording them. There's also over-the-shoulder testing, right? So you're just basically sitting behind or next to somebody as they're using your website. There's also these kind of like remote services, so you can ask a user to record themselves following your test plan or following your test script, and then you can watch those videos later. So I group all of these techniques in a direct observation group. So they're kind of just lumping them all together. And I think they are useful, but I think they have some inefficiencies when compared to A/B testing. The first of which is these aren't real users doing real things. You have to take people into a lab and you have to recruit these people to run the tests. And then they're going through a test script, so this isn't the way that people usually use your website. All this observation also takes time. You know, how many users do you think you can observe in a single day using these direct observation techniques? Now consider how many people we can observe using A/B test methods on our website. And it's also really hard using these techniques to effectively identify small changes in users' behavior. So how many observations am I realistically going to have to make to see a 2% increase or decrease in a user's behavior? Now, I'm not suggesting that you guys shouldn't use these techniques or that they're bad. They are helpful and we do use them. Often direct observation can tell us why something's happening, which is something that A/B testing isn't really good for. A/B testing usually just tells us something is happening. But for getting insight to how your users are actually interacting with your product and how they react to changes is really valuable, and it's something that's difficult to discover using these methods. You can also use another evaluation technique, which is just before and after, and it's just like it sounds. You make a change, well, you've got the before, you make a change, and then you compare it to the after, and you try to see the impact on performance. But before and after doesn't really provide a very accurate insight into the effectiveness of your design. So our traffic doesn't look like this, and neither does yours. Our traffic fluctuates over the course of a day. You know, each day is a little bit different. Week over week, our traffic is different. And you know, over the course of a year, each month is a little bit different for us. So it's really hard for us just to compare this week to last week or this month to last month and know with any certainty that it was only as a result of our change. For example, any change that we would make during the summer would always seem better with before and after evaluation. And likewise, any changes that we made towards the end of the year, they're always going to seem worse if we're just doing before and after comparisons. And it's not just seasonality that you need to look out for. There's all these other external events that can increase or decrease the amount of traffic you get. You know, other websites refer traffic to your sites, like search engines. You might have partners. Maybe you get mentioned in a TV spot or in the newspaper. Those things can affect your traffic. Or maybe sales lands a really big account, or they lose a really big account. That's gonna dramatically impact your revenue for that month. There's also stuff that you just really can't account for. You know, there's natural disasters and just, you know, network outages and all kinds of stuff that you just can't plan for, and it can disrupt your normal traffic. So don't rely on doing before and after comparisons to determine whether or not your designs are any good. It seems that the most common concern about A/B testing is this idea of the local maximum. But the local maximum isn't a reason not to do A/B testing. So it's typically described with a graph like this. And so you've got your current design, and that's that bump that's on the left. And your current design operates at a current performance, and that's represented by that orange dot. Now with A/B testing, you're going to make a lot of small iterative changes, right? You're going to try to improve the performance of your current design. So some of your tests are going to perform better, and some of them are going to perform worse. And you're going to do lots of different iterations. But at a certain point, more testing isn't going to provide any more performance. Right here at the top of this hill, this is the local maximum. It's basically the most optimized any implementation is going to be. All implementations have a local maximum. And basically, it doesn't matter if you run 10 tests or 100 tests or 1,000 tests. At a certain point, you're going to run out of performance. You're not going to be able to increase performance anymore. It seems like the concern is that you're going to become so focused with A/B testing to making small little changes to your website that you're going to miss out on a big opportunity and miss out on dramatic changes that could have benefited you and your users. It's this idea that there's a better design out there somewhere, and you're going to miss it because you're so small, tinkering around with small iterative changes. But I don't think that's a valid reason not to do A/B testing. And I don't think this graph is actually an accurate representation of reality. I think reality is really more like this. You really only know about your current design and all the tests that you've run with your current design. So you know your current performance and the performance of all the tests that you've run. And you have this idea for a better design. But at this point, it's not really a better design because it hasn't outperformed your current design. It's just a different design. Until this new design actually outperforms your current design, it's not any better. And the reality is, without data, we don't really know how much opportunity is out there or whether this design is actually going to be better. And I guess what people think is going to happen is something like this. If you're not A/B testing, you're not iterating. So I guess they think that they're just going to jump from their current performance to the top of this hill, that they're just going to reach the maximum potential for this better new design that they have in their head. They must think that they totally understand the environment, all the opportunity available, and how they're going to get there. What will probably happen is something like this. And the reason why I think this is likely to happen is because you don't have any information about how well this new design is going to perform. You don't know how much work it's going to take for this new design to perform any better than your current one. And you're not sure that this dramatically different system, which isn't an evolution of your current system at all, is going to be bug-free. I think realistically, the only way that you can make dramatic changes to your websites and to your designs is by using A/B testing. It helps us determine if there's any other opportunities even out there. And it gives us ideas about how big those opportunities might be. And it also allows us to reduce the risk of having to get it right the first time because we still benefit from the performance of the current design. And again, all designs have a local maximum, all of them. So just the existence of a local maximum shouldn't persuade you not to do A/B testing. Don't be scared by the local maximum, and don't think that you're going to get stuck only making small changes. You can make big changes using A/B testing. So the results of our A/B testing has provided some guidelines that we find generally useful and that I use whenever I'm evaluating designs, my own designs and other people's designs. The first one is this, and this isn't a particularly controversial position to take, but often designers, they specify that their link shouldn't be underlined. That link should really be indicated by color only. And I think underlining text is one of the most obvious and powerful signals we can provide users that text is clickable and that it's actionable. So underneath each result on our search results page, we offer job seekers several links. We let job seekers save the job that they're looking at. They can also email themselves or their friends the job. And there's this more link, and when they click on it, it exposes a bunch of links that were related to that particular search result. So, show me more jobs with this job title. Go show me all the jobs that are at this company. Try to estimate the salary for this job. So all of those links are exposed by clicking on that more link. And I wanted to do this test because I wanted to know, is underlining really important? Does underlining impact the usage of these features? So again, the test group is on the bottom, they're B. The control group is A, they're on the top. And the only difference between them was that I removed the underlines. The only way that users would actually see the underlines is if they actually hovered over the links. We wanted to see how job seekers responded. And for every link that we evaluated, we saw that the test group underperformed the control group. They saved less jobs, they emailed less jobs, and they clicked more, over 20% less than in the control group. So if my goal was to reduce usage of those 3 links, then underlining is a pretty good way to do it. But that's clearly not our goal. We want job seekers to use these more, not less. So if I want to clean up the search results page, and if I want to reduce some of the visual noise, I have to come up with a better solution than just to remove the underlines on these links. Users don't read. This is something that you'll often hear, or maybe you've read about it somewhere, but it's really easy for us to test out this theory. So I'm going to use this popular website as an example, and we're going to test out the users don't read theory. So users don't read is obviously untrue. This page is absolutely useless without text. Users primarily read. There's plenty of text on the web. People like text. People pay money to send text messages to one another. Text is good. Usually whenever you hear people, users don't read, what they typically mean is users don't understand novel or complex ideas, that they won't follow complicated instructions, or that they won't read really long text if it's not content. And I think all those things are true, but users don't read isn't true. Words are probably the single most important part of our interfaces. So we let job seekers sign up for what we call job alerts. Basically, they'll do any job search, and then they'll give us their email address. And tomorrow we'll send them search results that match that search. So it's a convenient way for them to get new jobs emailed to themselves. The forms to sign up for these email job alerts are available on every single search results page. So I was really interested in this caption. I wanted to know if this caption actually mattered to our job seekers. So again, on the top is the A group. That was the control group, and that's what we currently had on the site. And I wanted to see what the impact would be if we removed that small caption underneath the form. You can cancel email alerts at any time. Had been used on the search results page ever since I think I started working here. I don't remember any tests confirming that it was actually necessary, and I wasn't sure that it was effective. And so if it's not effective, I just want to get rid of it. But actually, by removing it, worldwide job alert signups decreased by about 4.5%. And in the United States, the decrease was even more substantial. Now, I know like maybe 4.5%, that doesn't really sound like a lot, but just by removing that single sentence, it would have resulted in us not sending hundreds of millions of emails to job seekers over the course of a year. So those words definitely do matter to job seekers. Recently, we ran another test, and again, this was around job alerts. And we wanted to see if we could improve the button label that was associated with our job alerts. So up at the top, A, that's what we were using at the time, and it said Save Alert. And we wanted to see if we could come up with a more convincing button label. So last October, we ran a test, and we compared 7 different button labels. We've got the control on the top, and we tested these 6 variations. Now, users always saw the same variation. So if they saw subscribe, they always saw the word subscribe. We didn't rotate them around. And actually, whenever we set up this test, I was pretty confident that Send Me New Jobs was going to perform the best. Not only did I think that it was super descriptive, but it was also really long, and I thought I was kind of cheating because it was like the biggest button. You know, it was just like, it's the biggest button, of course that one was going to win. But actually, that's not what we found. Activate increased signups by the most. And what I found surprising about this test was that every single option that we tried outperformed what we were using. Every single one of them. So for years, we had just been using this button label, and we just didn't really think about it. And every single thing that we tried outperformed it. So for years, we've just been missing out on sending job alerts to people because we just never got around to testing that label. So both of these tests were really easy to implement. They were just both changing some words on the page. But I think they illustrate the impact that words have on our interfaces. Often as designers, I don't know if we concentrate enough on what's getting said, only on how it's getting said, how it's presented to the users. And I think we miss out on a really big opportunity to improve our interfaces. So I don't like the phrase that users don't read, mostly because it's just inaccurate, but also because I don't want anyone to believe that the words that they choose don't matter. They're really critical to your product. So we found pretty much any place where only an icon is used, a word would be more effective. On our mobile search results page, we provide users options to improve their search results. And they get displayed whenever they tap on this icon. So they tap on this icon, and we show them these options that are available. So they can sort by date or relevance. They can change the radius of their search. And they can also choose an option that lets them view jobs that they can apply to on their mobile device. So whenever they choose that option, they only see jobs that they can actually apply to using their phone or tablet. But we were curious about if the icon that we're using for that button, called the double down chevron icon, we were wondering if that was actually the best icon we could be using. So we tested our initial idea, our initial icon, against the gear icon, which seems to be a pretty popular representation of settings or options. And we found that the performance of the two was basically the same, that people didn't use the controls that were exposed by pressing that button any more or any less, regardless of the icon that we used. So last fall, instead of testing a different icon, we tested a different text label, or we tested a text label. And in this case, we tested the word options. So overall, by using the word options, usage of the controls that were exposed by pressing on that button increased by about 2.5%. Now again, that doesn't sound very much, but they don't have to use these controls very often. And in fact, this one particular control, apply from jobs from your phone, so they didn't have to use it very much. But job seekers requested nearly 14% more search results pages that only showed them jobs that they could apply to on their mobile device just by changing the text label. And we thought this was great because users saw more jobs that they could apply to immediately. And as a result, users applied to more jobs. So I'm going to finish with a word of caution about testing multiple changes all at once. And this concerns our mobile website. So when we initially developed this mobile website, we were really only targeting iPhone users. And we were quickly adding features, but there wasn't really a good organizing principle. Again, we were still kind of young, we didn't really know what we were doing. We wanted to add stuff, but when we added it, it didn't really look like anything in particular. We just kind of added it, and so it looked like whoever implemented it was basically deciding what it looked like. There wasn't really a good organizing principle. So I decided that I was just going to make it look like a native iOS app. I figured that was a good choice, and at least it would just look like something coherent, and we could deal with it later. But as mobile grew, later came, and it was mostly because of Android, right? We felt that it wasn't an ideal experience for Android users to see an iOS UI on their Android device. And it really wasn't clear to me at the time if we could deliver an Android UI, if we could figure out what one even was. It seemed like every time that Google updated Android, the UI was changing, and there was a bunch of vendor-specific changes that made it really hard for us to tell what an Android UI would be, even if we wanted to implement one. So we decided that we were just going to make an Indeed UI. It's just going to be something specific to touch devices, and that it looked good across platforms, but it really wasn't trying to fit into any particular platform. So just some side-by-side comparisons of, again, the control is A, and what we fielded is B. That was the home page. This is the search results page. And this is the page that users see whenever they're viewing a specific job. And actually, I think the designs that we came up were pretty straightforward. They weren't revolutionary or controversial in any way. They seemed like they were pretty plain and boring. And after several internal reviews, we decided that we should just test it. And at this point, I kind of just felt like testing was a formality. I thought the test would go fine, that these weren't big changes. This didn't really seem like a big deal. So we just changed all the differences in the two designs at once. And the testing didn't go very well at all. So some key metrics were down. Searches were down. People looked at less jobs. They were tapping less jobs, so job clicks were down. People were saving less jobs. The most dramatic change that we saw was that homepage, the button to go back to the homepage, the usage of that button dropped by almost 50%. Now, this was a big concern because we replaced this button that said search with this icon with a little magnifying glass. Now, earlier I said something about icons always perform worse than text labels, and here's another example of that happening. And we actually thought that this button was causing all of these other problems. That was one theory, that if users weren't able to get back to the home page, then they weren't able to do more searches, so they're clicking on less jobs, and they were saving less jobs. Maybe if we just fix this home page button issue, then all the other metrics that were performing worse, they're all going to come in line. So we decided, let's just see if we can try another icon, and maybe they just don't understand what that magnifying glass icon is. We're going to try a home icon and see if that actually helps. But the performance was the same. So the next thing we did was we waited. We thought, well, maybe they just need to get used to it, and over time, everything is just going to go back to normal. They really just need to get used to this new design. But they didn't, and actually in some cases, their behaviors were diverging. So it was actually getting worse and worse over time. So that definitely wasn't good. So we just stopped the test, and we regrouped. We went back to just using the buttons with the text labels instead of the icons. It just didn't seem like that was going to work. One of the things that we overlooked during the implementation and in evaluating the design, and it really wasn't our intention, but the initial B group that we fielded, we changed the prominence of the same button compared to this view job button. So the button on the top that you'll see in the B group, that blue button, It says View Job, and if you tap on that, you go and view the job on a third-party site. Under that, there's that gray button, and that's the Save Job button. And the implementation that we initially fielded performed almost 8% worse than our control group. We thought this change in prominence was actually the cause for this decrease in saved jobs. So we updated the B group, and we changed the color to make them so that both of those buttons were the same color, to make the prominence of those buttons the same. And that actually fixed the problem. So we figured out what the saved job button problem was. So while we managed to figure out that problem, no matter what we did, we tried several other things, but no matter what we did, we still couldn't get the metrics up to where the control group was. Searches were still down, and people were still looking at less jobs. And eventually, we just stopped the test, and we broke up the design into several individual units that were easier to test. And that's what I really should have done to begin with. I should have just tested each one of these individual changes by themselves. It would have been a lot easier for us to isolate when there were problems. So for example, that header treatment, that nav bar treatment, it would have been really obvious that was the cause of a problem, and we could have just addressed that very quickly instead of waiting around and trying to figure out if there's other things that were causing problems. And by not changing, or by not testing these changes individually, we not only wasted a lot of time, but we lost a lot of momentum. So I'm not suggesting with this example that you shouldn't make dramatically different designs or different experiences for your users. I definitely think you should. And I think it's important that you have an outlook on where your product is going. But I think it's important that whenever possible, you validate each individual piece of that radical new design. So at this point, you guys might be asking, really, like this is the big insights. You should underline links. You change button labels. You replace icons with text. These all seem like they're pretty lame. The only example that I gave where it actually looked like there was any design going on, that thing failed. Like that didn't even work. Like this, I don't know. For some people, they're thinking that, if this is A/B testing, then I don't want to have anything to do with it because I don't want to be sitting around and changing button labels all day. But that's not what A/B testing is. I specifically chose these examples because I think they would probably relate to most of the people in the audience. Probably a lot of you in the audience have occasion to maybe use one or more of these insights and just test them out. See if they work for your users. Are there places where you can underline something? Are there places where you can replace an icon with a text label? Are there places where you can change just a button label or add or remove some text and maybe get a dramatic increase in performance? So I thought it was kind of relevant and general for the overall audience. But what A/B testing is for us isn't what A/B testing has to be for you. If you don't want to test button labels, you don't have to test button labels. That's fine. You can test more dramatic designs. And I just really want to stress this: A/B testing isn't going to restrict you creatively. This isn't going to confine you. You're going to be able to get farther, faster. You're going to be able to ensure that your designs are actually effective, and you're going to be able to try more things because it's okay to fail in this environment. Big changes are the result of many small changes. One too many. So that progression was actually missing a lot of steps because it's only showing the top of the search results page. And it's only showing all the things that were actually successful, that we actually implemented today. There's a lot of things that weren't successful and that failed. I personally have a lot of big ideas on how we're going to improve the job search experience for our users. And probably everybody at Indeed, they all have big ideas too, and they're probably a lot different than mine. But we're going to test all those ideas. And what we ultimately end up with is going to be better than what we have today. So here to talk about all of this from the product perspective, here's Senior VP of Product and Engineering, Chris Himes.
Hello. Hello. All right. Thanks, Chris, and thank you all for coming. This is the biggest crowd we've had here. It's nice to have you all here. So Chris talked about this idea of how we use data and how it informs our design process. And I'm going to talk about essentially the same thing, but how it informs our product process. And you might see some folks around here wearing this shirt. This is why we're here. So we come to work every day because we're here to help people find jobs. And so from a product perspective, what that means is the most important question that we ask, and that we ask multiple times every day, is what is best for the job seeker? That's really the guiding principle for all of the decisions that we make. And so the follow-up question is, well, how do we know? How do we know what's best for job seekers? And the answer is, as Chris, I think, pretty eloquently outlined, we test and measure absolutely everything. So I'm going to talk about both of these. I'll start with the measurement side because this is obviously a prerequisite to testing. There's kind of three things that you need to do in order to be able to effectively measure what's going on in your product. And the first is you have to keep track of everything that happens so you can go back later and ask questions about it. And so in our case, that means that we log pretty much everything that happens on Indeed. This right here is a set of all the metrics that every time someone does a job search on Indeed, we record. So there's 129 different metrics right now that every single search that happens, we record all of these different metrics. And so this job search index or this job search log, this is actually one of about 114 indexes we have. So if you look across all of the different events in our system, there's 114 different types of events or sequences with dozens of different types of metrics. So it's 10,000 or more individual things that we're capturing at any point in time. And when you look across everything that's happening, so on Indeed, on a monthly basis, we have an average of about 16 million jobs. We have about 100 million unique visitors every month, and those job seekers perform about 3 billion searches every single month. So when you put that all together, it's a lot of information. It's about a terabyte a day of data that we generate and then have to process and do things with. So this is not an engineering talk about how that all works. We have actually a really great blog post on our engineering blog that talks explicitly about how this all works. And if you're interested, I would refer you to the blog to check it out. But what I want to talk about is how we're able to use that. So we log all this information. That's step one. And then steps 2 and 3 are you basically have to build indexes on top of that data, and then you build some tools that allow you to ask questions about it, to query those indexes. Steps 2 and 3, that's also another tech talk. And it's one that we're definitely going to do, and there's a lot of interesting meat in there. But again, I wanted to focus on the kinds of questions that we're able to answer because we do all this stuff. So we have these tools, and we've built a bunch over time. We started initially by having all these logs, and then just people sitting down and writing programs one at a time to go and grep those logs and answer questions. And eventually it became clear that in order to be able to move as quickly as we wanted to build things where we're not just someone who's writing code, but anyone in the company could go ahead and ask these questions. And so one of the most useful tools we have is this thing called Ramses, which basically allows us to plot kind of time series slices of all of our different data. And so it can answer all different kinds of questions, like throughout the course of the day, how many job searches do we have in Japan versus Great Britain by hour? Or country by country, what percentage of the resumes that we're getting, where are they coming from, and how is that changing over time? Or when we send out these job alerts that Chris talked about, how many different impressions do we have based on the email domain of all the different emails that we're sending to? Or when we have our mobile apps downloaded, what percentage of app downloads come from iOS versus Android versus Windows Phone, which is that tiny little green line at the top over there. But we can measure that. Or things like when we have a failover from our data centers, how quickly do the other data centers pick up? You look at this picture over here, and you see, the normal sort of changes over the course of the day between traffic shifting from one data center to another. And then over there on the right, we have an event in this red area, and the other data centers very quickly pick up the traffic. And then once the data center comes back online, the traffic shifts back. So pretty much anything that has to do with business metrics, performance, any type of measurement, we have the ability to go in and ask these questions in an ad hoc way and get an answer right away. And so now that we have all this measurement in place, as Chris said, we test everything. And by everything, we really do mean everything. We test, we talked about text changes and visual design, different things like different layouts, moving different items from one piece of a page to another. Control flow, so there's a number of different places where we have conversions that happen when someone is uploading a resume or posting a job. We can move around different pieces of those. Is it more efficient to have someone create their account at the end of the process or at the beginning of the process? When do you ask for a credit card? This might be not totally intuitive, but new features. So you normally think of testing as changing something, but testing can also be introducing something completely new that we didn't used to have. So we have a new feature. We think that job seekers might like to do this new thing. We're going to put a test group together and introduce this new feature and compare not just how does that feature work, but how does that impact the entire experience on Indeed? Because people are doing a whole bunch of other stuff. You introduce something new, and it's going to change the ecosystem. And then this is the last time I'm going to say this is another tech talk. Algorithms. So we're a search engine. We have 3 billion people a month doing searches. We spend a lot of time and energy trying to make sure that when someone searches for a visual designer job in Austin, Texas, that the first result that comes up is the absolute best one. We got a whole team focused just on doing that and testing every single one of those so different people see different versions of these algorithms. Not going to go into this today, but it's a significant part of what we do here. So to get back to this example that Chris was talking about, and just talk very, very high-level simple mechanics. So we have these two test groups. We have the control group, which is the gray button. We have the test group, which is this blue button. And the first thing that we do when a job seeker comes to Indeed is we split our traffic. So a typical test for us might be we start with 5%. Depending on how big or how risky the change is, we might start with a smaller group. They might get 1%, or if it's something that's a little simpler, it might get a larger. But we start with a small and controlled group. Every job seeker who comes in gets randomly assigned to one test group or another. And now we do that across the 114 different tests. So actually, the first time you visit Indeed, you get assigned randomly to 114 different test groups. And then every single search, click, event that happens after that, we know what test groups you're in. Once you enter a test group, you stay in that test group for as long as you're using that browser. So then we talked about logging, and we log all these events and everything that happens. Well, we log along with this what test group you're in. And so, for example, this test group might be called blue button test. And by convention here, the control group gets a 0, and all of the other test groups get numbers after that. So we have blue button group, blue button test 1 and 0 and blue button test 1. And so once we then introduce this test group information into the logs, we can go back to these tools and ask questions not about how many downloads or how many clicks or how many applies do we have, but how do those compare from a control group to a test group. So one important thing to mention at this point is that statistical relevance is actually really important. As Chris mentioned, there's a lot of things that we're doing where we're looking for changes that are 1%, 2%, 3%. And it's very easy to just look at two numbers and divide them out and be lulled into a false sense of security about the fact that this change is real. So there's a number of different mechanisms for measuring statistical relevance. We happen to use a measure which is called the p-value. And the p-value, again, this is the last bit of math that will be in this talk. P-value is a statistical measure that the most simple way to look at it is it tells you what the probability that the change that you're observing between a control group and a test group is likely to be from random chance, just random fluctuations, versus being causal from the actual change that you made. And so typically, people look for a p-value ranges from 0 to 1. A p-value of 0.5 means that there's 0.05 means that there's a 5% chance or less that this thing happened randomly. And so typically, we look for tests that produce a p-value of less than 0.05. And so there's a couple implications, is then just to we're almost done with the math, to just sort of understand what this looks like. So a big change, observing a big change, actually doesn't require a huge amount of data. If you're calculating p-values, so let's say you're doing a number of trials, you have some event like posting a job that has a 10% conversion, and you make a change where you observe a 30% increase in that one metric. With only 1,000 trials, you can get a p-value of about 0.038, so less than 4% chance that this is random, and that's pretty good. Now, if you want to run that same test with a 10% conversion and observe a 1% increase, it takes about 750,000 trials. So depending on the usage pattern that you have of your product, observing these smaller changes can be a lot more difficult. And so p-values and statistical relevance is important enough to us that we just went ahead and built another tool for it. So the first tool that we have that shows these comparisons between these groups, you can go ahead and say, show me the statistical relevance, and you get a whole bunch of data, and you can actually observe the visual representation as well of what the likelihood of the divergence between these two different behaviors is. So math is over. We're going to talk about product now. So like Chris talked about the design principle, some of these things that we've learned from years of using data to make our decisions. I want to talk about the same kind of thing, but from the product perspective. The one thing that I will say, Chris bothered me earlier because I'm using underlining here, which suggests that this might be clickable. That's just trying to draw a distinction between the sections here. But so the first principle, there's no such thing as a no-brainer. And I think Chris gave a couple examples of certainly cases where he thought or we thought that we were going to do something that was just going to work, and why bother even testing? If you do enough testing, you'll pretty quickly realize that most of your ideas are not sound or do not necessarily prove out unless you happen to be your own user. So this is actually, I think, a pretty simple example of that. So about a year ago, if you came to our site as an employer and clicked on the little employer link on the top, it would take you to this landing page. Two key actions that we're trying to get employers to do. You can either post a job or you can search for resumes. And so one thing that everybody knows is people like free stuff. So we figured that if we wanted to increase the conversion of people posting jobs, we could just tell people it was free. Take a little $50 coupon and give them $50 of free clicks. And so the only change here between these two is just a try it free $50 credit on new accounts. Again, seems like it should be pretty obvious, no-brainer. We reduced signups by 30%. So now the interesting thing about this, besides the fact that we were totally wrong, is there's a corollary to this theory, which is that if a test fails, what that means is precisely that test failed. It doesn't mean that your idea was wrong. And a lot of times it's very easy to get tripped up and say, oh, I tried this thing and it didn't work. And Chris gave a couple examples where we tried another icon. Well, maybe there was another icon in there that could have performed better. It's important to remember that the only thing that we learned from this is that this test didn't work. So we went back and looked again, and we're actually confusing or combining two different things in here. We're saying try it free, but then we're talking about a $50 credit. And maybe it's more useful to separate the two. So when you come and you click on that button, you go through a bunch of steps, you end up in this pricing page. And so this next test that we ran, we took the pricing page and just added the description about the coupon there. So the first $50 is on us. And then when we went back to the button itself, well, we just took the lesson that we had before, which is that text matters, and we just changed the button text. Instead of post job, it says post a job for free. And that actually worked. So we got 25% more signups this way. And this is something that we have continued to improve over time and actually got a lot of improvements. And as Chris said, they're not all just from small different text changes. But it is important to recognize that the simple things don't always work the way that you do. And if something doesn't work, it's reasonable to try again. So the next principle I want to talk about is kind of the opposite of there's no such thing as a no-brainer. Sometimes very, very small things can have a really, really huge impact. So to reintroduce the search results page, this is again the search results page as it looked a couple of years ago. And there's just sort of two main parts I want to draw attention to. The first is this main text area. This is what we call our organic search results. So we got 16 million jobs. You come and search for this visual designer job in Austin, Texas, and we're going to show you the best job of all the jobs we possibly have. There's also the section on the top, and this is actually how we make money. Employers who want to promote their jobs, who want to make sure that they show up when someone's doing a search, they can come and set a budget. They set a maximum cost per click. We run a little auction, and the best matching jobs that happen to be sponsored for the most amount of money get shown in the sponsored block. And so from the very beginning, the background for this ad unit was blue. And we pay attention to what a lot of other people are doing and had noticed that at one point Google was testing a whole bunch of different colors for their ad units. So we decided to try a test of a different color. And the color that seemed to be most prominent was pink. So we decided to test out no changes at all. And again, in terms of the actual implementation effort here, and we're focusing on some of these simple ones, this is a 6-character hex change in a CSS file. Nothing else changed. And overnight, we got 34% more revenue. So that's significant enough that if you weren't convinced until now that small changes are important, you should pay attention. This is pretty big deal. And it's actually a big enough deal that it raises another corollary, which is when something really big happens, it is important to ask why, to dig a little deeper to make sure, because sometimes when big things happen, it's because things are going a little screwy. So we wanted to be sure. We really wanted 34% more revenue. That sounds great, but we wanted to make sure that there wasn't something strange going on. So the first thing we wanted to do was just understand, well, is color really that important? Is it possible that just by changing something like that, you can have a big impact? So we one of the other colors that Google had tested was green. We decided to test the green out. On any other given day, 10% increase in revenue would be pretty significant. This actually helped us at least feel better about the fact that color is really significant. Didn't perform as well as the pink, so we ended up sticking with the pink. The next question is, well, is it possible that people were just bored of blue? We had blue for so long, and you change it. Maybe it's just I showed up one day on the site, and oh my God, there's pink there. I'm going to start clicking on it. So we segmented the data and just looked at people who had been on the site for 7 days or less, compared to the people who had been there from 7 up to a year. And it turns out actually the people who were there newer had a slightly larger increase from this change. When we go out beyond a year, it was also large as well. But so this clearly was something that impacted everyone. It wasn't just for people who'd been around a long time. Then the last question, is this just a novelty thing? Is this something that will wear off over time? And as Chris pointed out, sometimes you leave a test running for a long time and the tests will converge. Sometimes they'll diverge. We actually rolled this out to 98% and left a 2% test group for several months. The results were unchanged. So this was actually a real impact for us. So the next thing I think informs not just kind of how we think about product, but actually how we do engineering here. And I think of this sort of as get the feature right first before you do it right. And so when you're building stuff, in our case, that has to work for 100 million people in 53 countries and 3 billion searches, there's a lot of work that you have to do, sometimes even for very simple things, to make sure that they scale, make sure that they perform. And if you have an idea and it's something that you think might be useful, it's not always ideal if you have to do all that work just to figure out if this idea is useful. When you're testing, and you can test on a very small group of people, you can build something that scales for 10 million people or for 1 million people and test it out that way. So a really good example of this is in France in particular, we had noticed that there's France is split into these administrative regions, and Paris is part of, and my pronunciation is terrible, but Paris is part of Ile-de-France, which is the admin region around the city, and it encompasses most of the metro area. Most people who post jobs in Paris, or a lot of them, say that the job is in Paris, but sometimes they say that the job is in Ile-de-France. And if you came in and you searched in Paris, it's more restrictive. You would miss out on all of those jobs that are actually there because somebody labeled them a different way. So we came up with this idea where when you do a search for a specific admin region at whatever level it is, in this case, let's say Paris, we would get the search results from that one location, and then we would do a second search in the larger encompassing region and what's called backfill those results. So we would essentially merge those two together. So you'd get the results that were the closest match first, but if there was something in there that you were looking for that might not have matched, you'd run into it eventually. And so in this case, what we saw from this test, which was really great, was we got about an 8% increase immediately in people clicking on jobs. So what that meant was that people were finding more jobs that they were interested in, and we were doing a better job of matching them. Now, unfortunately, the performance, because of the way we did this the first time, it was very naive, and we were doing it simply because we wanted to test it. So positive numbers are not good when it's number of milliseconds that it takes the search engine to process this. So typically we're about 15 milliseconds, and this went up to about 240 milliseconds. So the nice thing was, though, we knew that the feature was useful. And at this point in time, it justified doing the work. So we took this feature, and if you look at the performance graph here, we killed the feature, we turned off the toggle, we spent a few days, implemented it the right way, released it again, and had exactly the right performance. So we were able to save our engineering effort to focus on things that we knew that were going to have the most impact. And when we looked at the performance results, clicks continued to be up afterwards. So this was a win all around. So the last principle I'm going to spend kind of the most time on, because I think it's one of the most important things that we've learned, which is the value of measuring everything. And this comes out in a couple different ways. The subtitle here of Beware of Unintended Consequences This is, again, doing things where you think one thing is going to happen and sometimes something else happens. So the first example I'm going to go through is April Fool's 2010. So every year at Indeed, we like to do something for April Fool's, lighten up the day for job seekers, do something that will put a smile on people's faces. And so in 2010, we had just finished a long year of launching a whole bunch of new countries. As I mentioned, we're in 53 countries and 26 languages. And so since we were on a roll, we built a site for Antarctica. And we put this little penguin on there as our mascot for the Antarctica site. If you look at this area over here where it shows how many jobs there are in the last 7 days, on the US site, there's 550,000 jobs in the last 7 days. In Antarctica, I just checked today, there's 1 in the last 7. So there are 220 jobs today in Antarctica. If you're interested, the site is still up. But when we launched this, we figured no one was going to find it, so the best way to introduce it to people would be to introduce it on the job search page. So if you came into Indeed and you did a search for Java jobs, we would say, well, maybe you're looking for Java jobs in Antarctica. And we added this little penguin guy over there. Because, even though it was only 1 day, we released it in a test group because that's kind of how we do things. And we sat down the next day to look at the results. And clicks were up slightly, kind of interesting. And maybe it was a novelty thing. People were having a good time. Job alert signups down 17%. So, that got us scratching our head. Again, if this was a real feature, we'd be concerned about that because we do want people to be able to sign up for their job alerts. Revenue up 15%. So that was surprising. Again, if this was a real feature, revenue going up is a nice thing, but not generally if you're not trying to make revenue go up. And so what this made us do was to sort of kind of take a step back and think about what was actually going on. So looking at where the change was introduced, the first thing that you'll notice actually if you look at any of these things, and especially because of Chris's obsession with text and not images, there's actually not a whole lot of icons on our site. We have our logo. We have that little mail icon there when you sign up for job alerts. Those are actually the only images on the entire site. So we introduced a third image, which is, while it's small, when you have a pretty sparse UI, these things stand out. And so one of the things that we do know is that anytime you introduce something new, it increases focus and attention on the things that are surrounding it. And if you look at what's right next to this guy, in fact, it's sitting right on top of the sponsored job unit. So the hypothesis was people were seeing this thing, it drew their attention there, and maybe they were bored with blue and they hadn't noticed it in a while, so they went back and decided to click on some more sponsored jobs. So to validate this, though, we did want to look around and say, well, what else is in the same area? Because if that's true, it should be true pretty much everywhere. And interestingly, when you look above, is the job alert signup widget. And if you remember, job alert signups went down 17%. So this seems to invalidate our hypothesis, except for the fact that there's 2 places you can sign up for a job alert. So you can sign up for a job alert on the top, but then also at the very bottom, right next to the page navigation, there's also another job alert signup widget on the site. And when we looked at job alert signups on the top versus bottom, so overall on the whole site, down 17%. Bottom signups were down 21%, but top signups were up 6%. So clearly there was some halo effect from the penguin, and we rested a little easier from that analysis. So the corollary for this one, though, and this is kind of an interesting concept, is that the way I like to think of it is attention is a zero-sum game. Chris maybe put the usually in there because it's not always true. Sometimes we do introduce features that just make people search more or make people click more. But typically, you have a fixed amount of information and things that someone can do, and if you introduce one new thing, you got this new feature, this new button, this new widget, it's going to take attention away from somewhere else. And so one of the things this leads us to do when we evaluate test results is to have some notion of the relative value of different actions. So some of the actions that we've already talked about today, searches, clicks, revenue, email signups, resume creations. This last example, if this was a real feature, we'd be evaluating, is more revenue okay in the face of lost email signups? And that's a question that really, everyone has to kind of look at their own way. I almost think of this as sort of the relative value of chess pieces. People who play chess know that a knight is worth less than a queen, and you'd be happy to trade your knight for a queen any day of the week. And so for us, we look at all these different metrics, and we have our own internal calculus that says one thing is more valuable than another, or how many of these are we willing to give up for something else. And it's important to think about stuff like that, because most tests that you run, if you look at everything, something else is going to go down if something goes up. And what that answer is it is different for everyone. It's different for every site, but it's an important thing to think about. So the last example that I want to give is a feature we call location autocomplete. And so when you come to Indeed and you search, there's two text boxes. There's the what, which is what type of job, skills, job title, company am I looking for, and then the where, which is where am I looking. And one of the things that we see looking at all of our data is that people are not really all that great at spelling. Certain things they're really bad at, like the word administrative, nobody seems to be able to spell. Tallahassee, also apparently very hard to spell, even if you live in Tallahassee. And so if you spell Tallahassee wrong, you end up on what we think of as the saddest page on Indeed. This is the zero results page. This is we got nothing. And generally, we don't like that. We like to give people stuff that they're looking for. So we had this idea that when people are searching, what we could do is take all of the locations that we have and provide some suggestions and autocomplete for them as they're searching. And so the way that it works is we basically we take the first set of characters someone's typed, we have all the locations based on the most likely one that they're going to click on, we order them. If you click on one of those auto-suggestions, we go ahead and submit the search for you. So we roll this out. First thing we look at, zero results pages are down 2.7%. So that's huge, actually, because zero results pages don't happen all that often, but when they do, it's an important miss for us, and so anything we can do to move that metric is really a big deal. We look at clicks across the whole site. Now, these autocomplete is a pretty rare thing, and so clicks across the whole site, job clicks, not affected, but when we look just at the case where someone did an autocomplete and accepted that suggestion, clicks were up 8%. So when we actually helped someone find a location, we got 8% more of jobs that they were interested in front of them, and that's a great thing. And then keyword ad revenue was up 1,400%. So that's another red flag. Let me just back up and explain. So keyword ads, we talked about the organic results and the sponsored results. We had this other section off to the side, and this is a product we actually don't have anymore, but for a long time, we gave employers and advertisers the ability to bid on specific keywords, kind of had our own product like Google AdSense, where we would just do an auction and show the best matching ads there. There's really nothing about helping people type in a location that should lead to 1,400% increase in clicks on these more or less irrelevant ads on the side. And so that's, again, it's a red flag for us. So we started to, we went through all the data and then basically just kind of had to go back to the UI to understand what was going on. And on a much closer inspection, what we determined was, well, the behavior, as I mentioned, when you do a search, if you clicked on one of those auto-suggests, we would go ahead and submit the search. And the next thing, though, because people weren't necessarily expecting that, is they would go ahead and try to click on the Find Jobs button. Our search results come back so fast that oftentimes the results would come back before they actually got there. And if you look right behind that button, what you end up on is the top keyword ad slot. Now, this is something that if we were not testing, we clearly wouldn't have known. But if we were not testing and looking at irrelevant metrics, we would never have known that we actually created a really bad user experience here. Because this is someone who was looking for a job in Tallahassee, Florida, and instead got 3 credit scores. So the fix was basically when someone clicked on that suggestion, we just went ahead and pre-filled the where box. We didn't submit the search, made them click the Find Jobs button, and keyword ad revenue went down the way it should be. So measure everything and really measure everything every time. We spent enough time doing this every time we'd run a test that someone would go through and check this metric and check that metric and check that metric and check that metric that we built another tool for this. So we have a tool that basically for any single test we run across all the different test groups and across all of the super secret key metrics that we look at in every single test that we run, just gives us a glance, and we can pick any date range for any single one of those tests. And these are the metrics that we think are important that we look at every single time we run a test. And with this tool, we now know that everyone looks every time. What it also does is there's little numbers off to the side, so it calculates the p-value and shows you which of these results are statistically relevant, which ones are not quite yet, and then highlights any changes that are greater than or less than 1%. So you can actually see at a really simple glance, green versus pink, which tests are winning, which tests are down. This also illustrates, I think, really kind of dramatically this zero-sum game thing, because there's not a single test that we have here that's just green everywhere. When something goes up, something else comes down. So one reasonable question to ask is, great, you have 3 billion job searches and 100 million visitors. I don't, can I do testing? And there's actually a bunch of different ways to do it, and there's one really practical one that I recommend. There's a company called Optimizely. It was started by an ex-Google guy who had done a whole bunch of this stuff at Google, and it's a very affordable, self-serve tool. It's actually so good we use it for some of our content-based testing. So it won't help you do things like testing different algorithms and stuff like that, but for any content-based layout, visual design, it's a non-coding point and click. You basically point it at a page. You click on an element that you want to change. So you can click on this post job button. You can edit the HTML. You can edit the image. And it just creates different test groups for you. And then it actually has all of the math built into it. So it will calculate p-values for you. It'll tell you whether your test results are significant. It'll draw nice, pretty pictures for you. So if you have no infrastructure and you're doing nothing, this is something you can do tonight when you go home. A couple things to think about. When you have less data, you probably have to run fewer tests. Different products of ours don't all have 3 billion events in a month. We have a whole bunch of people who are searching for jobs. We have less people who are searching for resumes. We have less people who are posting jobs. And so we don't have 84,000 variations on those tests if you've got 100,000 or 200,000 people using something. The other big one is, and again, by focus on big wins, what I don't mean is that usually we're focused on small wins. We're trying to do things that are going to have a big impact. But what it means is, from a statistical perspective, if you can't do something that's going to have a big impact, you're not going to be able to measure it without waiting a very, very long time. And waiting a very, very long time is sort of counter to what to how we want to do things. So if you look back at these p-value calculations here, there is a way mathematically to figure out, given the event that you're working on, how much of an improvement you need to match the number of trials that you have. So one possible way to think about this, and for example, in our job posting product, we approach things very differently, and it's something like this. So you sort of look at what are the number of trials that you have in a week. How many times does someone come and do this one thing that you're trying to improve? You do the math and figure out what's the minimum improvement that you need to actually measure a statistically relevant improvement in that 1 week period, and do a new test every week. And if you cross that threshold and successful, great, you roll out that test. If you don't reach it, you just have the discipline to say, great, this wasn't big enough, shut it off and move on to the next test. It sometimes gets very tempting to, oh, this 5% is cool, it looks pretty good, but you can end up waiting 3, 4, 5 weeks for the relevance to pop up, and it's better to just close it down and move on to the next big thing. So in summary, what we get out of this, obviously there's, we think that there's a lot of benefits from doing product and design the way that we do. The first one actually was a surprise to me when I got here. This wasn't something I was expecting. We have a measurable impact on just the overall quality of our product, not just the performance of it, and we have higher percentages and higher numbers, but the actual quality in terms of bugs or lack thereof. Anyone who builds software knows that no matter how much automated testing you do, no matter how awesome your QA team is, and ours is really awesome, bugs occasionally slip out. You got 100 million people interacting with your thing very differently than you might have anticipated. Because we measure everything, it's impossible for a bug to get out into production without it showing up as a decrease in clicks, a decrease in revenue, a decrease in resumes. We notice these things very, very quickly before users tell us, hey, something is broken. And that is a real meaningful impact to us. Risk tolerance. So, Chris talked about the fact of people sometimes look at A/B testing as you're just doing a bunch of little tweaking and not really getting anywhere interesting. Because we have this mechanism in place where we can release something to 1% of Firefox users in Malaysia only, that allows us to basically limit the worst thing that can happen if we release a feature that's really, really terrible. The worst thing that happens is a very small number of people have a not optimal experience, and they have a better experience as soon as we turn that feature off. And so what that allows us to do actually is be willing to try pretty much anything. There's very few ideas that are too radical or too lunatic for us to be willing to give a shot to, because we actually don't want to get stuck on the small hill. We want to get to the bigger hill. Probably the most important thing we get, and this comes from having a company like Indeed, where from the bottom all the way up to the top, people demand answers in the form of data. And so we have really here built a culture of measurement. And so there's a lot of companies, other ones that I've worked at before, where product decisions are made by the person who has the most impressive job title, or the person who is the loudest, or the person who is the most stubborn. And here the product decisions are made just by data. They're made by whatever is empirically best. And there is, hopefully from some of the examples that I went through before, there is a mix of art and science. It's not just boring, raw, you pull up a spreadsheet and then you're done. There's interpretation and there's trade-offs, but we make decisions based on what we know is best. And so at the end of the day, what we get is our products are better, and empirically so. And that is, frankly, why we're here. We're here to build great products, and the satisfaction of knowing that what we're doing is improving week over week, month over month, year over year, and making it easier for people to come and find jobs or whatever it is that you do. That's why we do this. So with that, thank you very much for listening. We'll open it up for Q&A.